What is it that motivates people? What makes you want to act in one way rather than another? Like perception, that's an aspect of psychology that people in most cultures tend to think is universal. We tend to believe that while societies have different customs, different traditions, different languages, and so on, at a deeper level, everyone wants pretty much the same thing out of life. If you think that money makes the world go round, that what really matters to people is material gain, you're not going to really believe it if you're told that for someone else that's not really true. You're going to think that deep down, that other person wants money just as much as you do. And that if they say they don't, they're either lying or they haven't gotten a big enough offer yet. Just as with perception, though, it's not at all clear that this is true. It's easy to say, for example, that everyone wants wealth, right? Everyone wants money, everyone wants wealth. But what is wealth? To you and to me, wealth is measured in money, a kind of thing that you can count numerically, that you can store easily, and that you can pile up endlessly. When I think about that, the image that always comes to mind is the comic book character Scrooge McDuck, who has this big vault full of endless stacks of gold coins into which he could always just pile more and more and more cash. But that's not the only way you can think about wealth, right? Remember Anka from the Cauca, Anka's Big Mocha? For Anka, you may remember, there was only one kind of wealth that mattered, and that was wealth in pigs. You could have all the money, all the cars, all the diamonds in the world, but if you didn't have pigs, you were nobody. Why? Because the whole point of wealth was to outdo your rivals in Mocha, right? Those ceremonial gift exchanges. And what mattered in Mocha was pigs. And pigs are a little different from gold coins. For one thing, you can't just stick them in a vault. It would get awfully smelly awfully fast, and Scrooge McDuck wouldn't want to spend a lot of time in there. For another thing, pigs require upkeep. They have to be fed and watered and cared for by human beings. That means you can't just accumulate pigs endlessly. The number that you can accumulate is conditional on the number of people you can get to do your pig maintenance. Wealth is something that has to be tended and maintained, which means that you don't want to have an unlimited amount of it. For the Cauca, unlike us, the goal isn't to have as much wealth as you can, but to have as much wealth as you need to achieve your goals in the cycle of Mocha. The structure of wealth in a society, in other words, shapes the role of wealth as a motivator for human action. More generally, the way culture shapes reality affects the kinds of things that motivate people. What people want depends on whether it is there for them to want, and that varies a lot from culture to culture. Now, another way to think about this isn't in terms of what people want, but in terms of what people need. What are the basic necessities of life? What is it that's absolutely essential for people to live and to thrive? Do people need love? Do they need food? Do they need belonging? Do they need shelter? Do they need sex? Again, this is something that is assumed in most cultures to be pretty universal, but it actually varies a lot. One good place to see this is in the treatment of illness. And there's a reason for that. When people are really sick, they can't provide for themselves. Other people have to look after them, to provide them with the basic necessities of life, right? And there generally has to be some sort of a standard way to do that in order for it to be effective. That means the treatments of illness offer a really good place to get an idea of what a culture sees as the basic necessities of human life. Now, hospitals are especially good for this. Hospitals are places where things have to be sterile. So they don't want things in there that aren't necessary. In a hospital room, you would only have things that were needed. They're also very expensive. Everything in a hospital costs about $18 billion, including the little paper robes that they make you wear instead of clothing that don't tie up in the bag. I really, really hate those. You may hate them too. But unless you're 6'5" like I am, you haven't experienced just how humiliating they can be. Anyway, since everything is so expensive in the hospital, they don't put anything in a room that doesn't absolutely need to be there. And of course, in most cases, you're not staying there for very long. It's not like you're going to be in the hospital room for months and months. In most cases, people are there for a couple of days, maybe a week, right? So you only need to have the basics anyway, right? With all of that in mind, hospital rooms tend to be a good place to see what a culture regards as the absolute basic needs of human life. Now, if you go into an American hospital room, what will you find? Well, you find a bed, of course. You'll find a call button, a little button that can be used to call the nurse for an emergency. You'll see a little tray on wheels that you can pull over to the bed in order to eat from. There will be a bathroom. There will be a sink to wash hands and so on. And of course, in a sacred place above everything else, there's going to be a television set. You've got to have a television set. I remember when my wife and I had our first baby, they had a television set in the recovery room, which is where you go after you've given birth. So you've spent, in my wife's case, 36 hours in labor. You come back and you spend some time in a recovery room just resting and getting ready to leave. That was back in 1990. Right, when our first child was born, before they invented LCD TVs. And televisions were great big heavy boxes with cathode ray tubes inside them. To lift a big TV, you really needed two people. They were huge. Now, the hospital room where we were staying had a 25-inch television suspended from the ceiling over the bed in a huge metal frame attached up to a brace in the ceiling. Now, what got me about it is that we did not have our first baby here in Plattsburgh. We had our first baby at the University of California, San Francisco Hospital, way up on Parnassus Heights in San Francisco, the earthquakiest place in the world. 1 year after the World Series earthquake that had reduced San Francisco and large sections of Oakland to rubble. My wife had just had a baby. Neither of us had slept in about 3 days, and watching TV wasn't a big priority for us. Was it really necessary to suspend an enormous metal death box over the bed just in case my wife had a sudden, unquenchable need to tune into a rerun of Family Feud? Well, obviously, yes. The TV was, in fact, that important. Why? Because for us in the United States, one of the basic needs envisioned by the culture is entertainment. Right? Boredom, the experience of lying in a bed and not having some entertainment to divert you is something seen as dangerous and even deadly, something that would make it difficult for a person in the hospital to thrive. And that's not just some untested assumption, right? They've done studies looking at the recovery rates for people in rooms with and without television, and sure enough, the ones with televisions do better. For Americans, that entertainment really is something essential. Now, it happened that about 3 months later, we wound up in another hospital room, this one in the provincial Danish city of Viborg. Our first daughter was born in July, very cute, and in late August, we set out for a year of field work on a small island in the northwest corner of Denmark, an island called Mors, up in northern Jutland. Now, shortly after we got there, our daughter became very ill. And after looking at her in the local hospital, her doctor said she really needed to be seen in Viborg, which was the capital of the province and which had a first-rate children's ward. They put us in an ambulance. It was funny. The ambulance came to the hospital. It picked us up. We drove by our house and waited while we went and picked up some clothes. Then we hopped back in, and the ambulance drove us about an hour and a half to Viborg. I can still remember the drive because the whole way over, I was trying to figure out how we were going to pay for it, right? I thought, well, we can sell the computer and we can probably raise some money on our credit cards, but that's not going to come anywhere near the cost of this ambulance ride. Then we finally arrived at the hospital and the driver got out with us. He walked us up to the front desk, let them know who we were and so on. And then it was the strangest thing. He reached out and shook my hand. He patted the baby on the head. He wished us good luck. And he walked back to the ambulance and drove away without saying anything about a bill. And then I realized, socialized medicine, wow! I have to say, I have been a fan of socialized medicine ever since. It was wonderful. Anyway, the point was, though, that they put us in a hospital room in the children's ward. It was a standard hospital room, but it was set up a little different from the one back in San Francisco. Now, it did have a bed, of course, and a bathroom and a sink, just like the one back home. It had a call button for the nurse. The television was missing. They had the TV on a cart that they could wheel into the room if you wanted one, but it wasn't standard issue, and nobody used it much. They also had two things that I have never seen in an American hospital room. One was a baby carriage, not a stroller, a full-sized carriage like the one Julie Andrews pushes around in Mary Poppins. And the other was a table, a wooden table with 4 wooden chairs and a candle in the center. Now, the differences reflected some differences in what the Danes saw as the essential needs of a human child, one of which was fresh air. Right? They believed very firmly that children needed to get outside, even small babies. There was no way that you could expect a child to recover if it had to stay indoors all the time. So there was a carriage, which you could take on the elevator up to the roof where there was a walking area, and there was a steady round of parents pushing children in big circles in these enormous baby carriages. Now, the other thing, of course, was people. Why did they need that table? Well, so that people could sit around it and eat. Right? How could you expect any human being to get well all by himself? A patient needed a family to come in, to bring a home-cooked meal, and to sit around the table like regular human beings. A table with a candle on it. They call it levende lys, the living light in Danish, which was an extremely important part of sociality in Denmark. That was something they saw as incredibly necessary. It created a problem for us, of course. Our families were on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, so they couldn't come by to visit. The hospital staff was really worried about this, and they made a point of visiting us constantly. Nurses and doctors would stop in and chat for an hour at a time. And to tell the truth, it really did help. It was certainly more entertaining than our TV set in San Francisco. The point is that there were different ideas in these two settings reflected in the hospital rooms about what the basic needs of human beings were. Now, differences in ideas about basic needs, about differences in motivation, raise serious questions for students of psychology across cultures. Are there any basic motivations that all of us share in common? Are there some things that all people need and need in pretty much the same way? If so, what would those be? And how much do our cultural understandings of the other ones differ from society to society? Right? How are differences in motivation constructed, and how do they affect the people we become? That's a big part of what psychological anthropology tries to understand.